Welcome to Frontlines. We'll take a moment here at the outset to allow people to do their shares and watch parties, and we'll get started in about 5-10 seconds. We'd like to welcome our viewers from across the United States and Canada, throughout Europe, as well as in Australia, and of course in Armenia and Artsakh. Today actually marks exactly 6 months since the signing of the trilateral statement ending the Third Karabakh War. We are in a moment of extreme flux and a lot of important issues to discuss, and I'd like to kick it over to Garo to introduce our guest for today before we get started.
Thank you, Karnig. Good evening, everyone in the continental United States, and good day everywhere else, and good morning in Yerevan and Stepanakert. We have a very special guest this evening with us, joining us from Yerevan, Armenia. But before I introduce our special guest, let me just take a moment and congratulate all those mothers from Artsakh to Yerevan and the diaspora. Armenian mothers are unique, despite the fact that all mothers are very special. And I want to wish everyone a happy Mother's Day here from Glendale. I also want to take a moment and recognize that today, at least here in Los Angeles, while Chicago is already May 10th and Yerevan is May 10th, but today is still the last couple of hours of May 9th, which is the anniversary of the Shushi liberation of 1992. It is a bittersweet day in that respect. And it is my hope that May 9th, 2022, will bring brighter skies above all of Artsakh, not just Shushi. Our special guest today is Eric Hacopian. And for those of you who have been hiding under a rock for the last several months, you would not know, but everybody else would know that Eric Hacopian is a political consultant who appears regularly on CivilNet and provides objective and valuable assessment about all things that are politically nuanced going on, not only in Armenia, but also beyond Armenia. He has 30 years of experience in this field, having worked on many campaigns at the United States, Southern California, and beyond local level, state level, and national level. He heads his own firm, consulting firm called EDH Consulting. I believe it's called EDH and Associates. And he joins us from Yerevan. Eric, good morning. Karnig?
Eric, thank you again for joining us here. You've said in one of your recent insights, which appears on CivilNet, that there is a way out of hell. And you've described the difficulty that Armenia finds itself in today. And you highlighted really two key elements that I wanted to kind of dig into a little bit more. And one is the importance of being cold-blooded in our pragmatism, and the other is hating mediocrity. And my question to you is, in the current state of finger pointing, which is what we see in the political environment, and really looking back as opposed to looking forward, what do you think the prospects of that are going forward with respect to, whether the vying political parties or just generally in terms of are we in a period where cold-blooded pragmatism is feasible? Or are we going to find ourselves forever stuck in looking backwards and criticizing and finger pointing rather than getting on with the business of state building?
Well, cold-blooded pragmatism is the only choice at this point. We have no options. What does cold-blooded pragmatism mean in the context of Artsakh? It means preserving what we have now, which is not a pleasant prospect, not compared to what we wish for. But right now, preserving what we have now is the most important thing. And that would require whatever understanding that needs to be made to make sure that people can live there securely in peace for the time being, while you continue to build the state and wait for the political moments to change. So that's cold-blooded pragmatism. The other thing is to be, laser focused on building the economy, At the end of the day, without resources, you can't do anything. So you need to build the economy. People forget that, in fact, between two different governments, the pre-revolutionary government and the post-revolutionary government, we had 2-3 years of very strong economic growth in Armenia. In fact, in 2019, we had the highest growth rate in Europe. So if we go back to that, and you go back to that for 5-10 years, you have a completely transformed country. Our growth rate in 2019 was 7%, which is, as you know, even though developing countries always have higher growth rates than non-developed countries, but still it was significant, and you could see it. And even today, people have a hard time understanding this, but we actually have a labor in Armenia. We have this dichotomy where you have a labor shortage, while at the same time you have unemployment, because people don't have the skill sets for the economy, that the jobs that are producing, specifically on the better paying jobs that the economy is producing. So it's cold-blooded pragmatism is focused on that, and more importantly, focused on state building, which is entirely unsexy. We pay the price, no matter this regime, that regime, this army, that army. We paid the price for not building the state for 30 years. We paid the price for not having think tanks for 30 years. We paid the price for not cleaning corruption out of the army. We paid the price for not having competence in the army, because we assumed things that weren't true as far as what they're capable of and what thinking they're doing. We found out they're hardly doing anything. So if you don't build, it starts with a competent economy. Competent economy leads to a competent state. Competent state leads to a competent military. State competence is something that is the #1 priority of this country. And as with all the fighting and infighting and name calling going on, frankly, that's the one issue that no one will disagree with. They'll disagree about how to get there. I always have this standard, I call it from the taxi driver to Ruben Bartanian. They will all tell you the same thing, that we don't have a competent state. Now, in all fairness, frankly, you look around the world, you can make the case that, I was reading a headline from The Guardian in India. The lead sentence was, India doesn't have a state. So the state competence is frankly, it's a universal issue. And if you see how COVID was dealt with around the world, you can make the case that there's hardly any competent states anywhere, even in the United States. So, but that's what's needed. It's just cold-blooded focus on the things that need to be done. Now, who's at fault and who? I can give you my interpretations of who's at fault for what. I think, frankly, the entire political class is at fault in different ways and different times. And the diaspora is at fault because of the way we approach Armenia, because the one thing that diaspora has never focused on is state building. We have the finest scholars in the world, and up until now, no one was building a think tank in Armenia. We have the finest doctors in the world, and our medical system doesn't have any islands of excellence. And you can go on and on. We have some of the best researchers in the world, but we don't have, the best. We don't have any world-class research facilities. We have some of the best scholars in the world, and we don't have a university that's in the top 500 in the world. And the diaspora has failed on many, and I can say this because I am one, because we have never changed our mode after 1991, that there's a country to build rather than a whole bunch of associations to keep going, because that's what we were used to. State building is a completely different process, and it's expensive.
Can I follow up real quickly, Garo?
Yes.
And I definitely see your point, and the value of particularly certain sectors of the economy. And you've touched upon this before as well. The idea of building the sector, the military-industrial complex, and garrison state. A lot of those concepts require it is impossible to do with respect in terms of the diaspora without any sort of institutional integration, right? I mean, there need to be institutions that are integrated and can really leverage the resources that exist among Armenians throughout the world. We hear the talk, right, of the diaspora having these resources and those resources. And it's a much more significant, you said it's an expensive undertaking, it's much more significant than a donations economy, a remittance economy. You know, this is clearly under the, you know, the Third Qarabağ War highlighted the fact that we are wanting of a military industrial complex that is a sector of the economy as it is in many states. And while other states, for example, like India might lack competence in certain areas, I think that from a national security perspective, I think that many Armenians were surprised at the lack of competence in that area. What do you see in terms of this? You know, you mentioned the diaspora. It's what type of projects, what type of undertaking in terms of integration, diaspora to state building institutions needs to take place? What is the timetable for really doing that, though? I think that, you know, with the fact that we have elections coming up, I think everyone's looking for band-aid solutions. What is really, you know, building a sector like that from a national security perspective? What does it take for a country in the environment that Armenia is in today?
Well, first of all, there's some things on that front that are better not discussed, so I'm not going to discuss them. But because it's just not something for public discussion. But those things are moving forward by different people, and I'll just leave it at that. However, what it requires, what is the attraction of that project or those kinds of projects is, you know, people forget how much of the Soviet military design and work used to get done here. People forget how much science used to get done here. I think someone I was talking to a scientist in the United States who was from Armenia. And he said that if Armenia was if the Soviet Republic of Armenia was actually an independent country, we would produce as many research papers back then as a country as Switzerland or Israel does. Peer-reviewed research articles. So, you know, the software is there or was there. Most of that software, frankly, is around the world now. And some of those people, few of them can come back. Almost all of them can cooperate with you. Some of them have retired, but this is a country that has the ability to produce brain power and still does on different fronts. So it's a question of prioritizing that. Some of it is, frankly, very practical. For example, you need to have not only, I mean, you know, we've discussed a lot about military reform, Truth Commission, and all that. And there's a lot of conversations, there's a lot of work on it. Frankly, all of that needs to wait to the election just because of the way the laws are set up. But for example, you know, you need to have a line item in the budget, which is a certain percentage of our military spending, which is not insignificant, needs to go to, you know, buy from local firms that are producing things that are world-class competitive. The attractiveness of a military industrial complex is that unfortunately, there's no end to the market that you're looking for. And two, it helps build other industries, specifically the sciences. And I think, you know, there's almost every day I'll get this, I shouldn't say every week I'll get some initiative by someone, and almost always well-meaning people, but it's some we're going to have one world congress where everyone gets together, from like Yuri Dorkaev, who was the forward for the 1998 French national team, to Vartan Gregorian when we had him, to, you know, 75 different people. None of them have nothing to do with each other. And all of these people are going to decide what we should do, and then everyone else follows. Well, that's not how the world works. And that's certainly not how Armenia works, because Armenian society, frankly, is an anarchist collective, if you really know how it works. It's like, you know, if you see anything that's successful in Armenia, in any sector, it starts off with one person, and then the second person sees the first person, and it sort of clusters into something. And you can look at even something as simple as the wine industry. That's how it started. You know, Ernegion started, and then after a while, everybody with money wants to get into the wine business. Now we make serious wines. That employs a lot of people. And we actually export a lot of it now. A good chunk of it to the United States, actually. Same thing with the tech sector. You know, we went from an outsourcing center to becoming a place that has a startup culture. Just, you know, it's small, but you see it, and you see it in the Crisps of the world, the Prixarts of the world, even Service Titan, which is actually based in the United States, but most of the good chunk of the work gets done here. So I think the way to approach things is not to wait for some universal, approach to things. Is you take your corner and you create your pocket of excellence in your area of expertise, because that's what you need. It's we have 2, 3, 4 islands of excellence. We need 20, 25 of them. And given the level of professionals that we have around the world, everybody picks their little corner and you can do it. I mean, it could be as simple as what you guys do on the human rights front, for example. It could be what I do as far as trying to raise the level of conversation. A good part of the audience for my work is actually not Armenians. It's sort of the diplomatic corps and the journalists from around, people who cover things in this region. And they all speak English. So you pick your own corner and you raise the level of work and conversation. But it involves engagement. It involves doing things. And I don't really see the point of finger pointing and name calling and any of that, even though, I can tell you 1,000 people that are blamed for different things. But what happens the day after that? What have you accomplished?
So I'm glad you're talking about picking your own corner and doing your own thing and building blocks bit by bit, corner by corner, perhaps. And that kind of reminds me of your remarks a few weeks ago when you said, don't look for saviors, do your own thing. Different people, there's no Mandela in Armenia, there's no this, there's no that. And you gave example, I think it was Sam Manoukian as one person who came in and did the Tumo Center and others. So on the heels of upcoming elections, parliamentary elections, June 20th, as I recall, to me at least, it looks like there are people out there who maybe they're not trying to say they're the savior, but they're certainly trying to say, different people, different factions, different coalitions, that they are the answer. They're the answer to go forward. And the average individual, when you speak to the average, you speak to the Armenian in the diaspora, and that's where I am, so that's who I mostly speak with. It's interesting how everyone has their mind made up. I'm with this person, I'm with that person. And when you ask those folks what they stand for, with the exception of very few, no one can really tell you why it is that they are with this or that. And so it occurred to me earlier today to kind of take a look and see that, because we had this, coalition of 16 or 17 that was in opposition post-war, calling for snap elections, or rather a transitional government. And I found out, and I don't know to what extent it's still accurate, that there are about 91 political parties in Armenia registered with, I believe, the Justice Ministry. Out of those 91 parties, whether they're 91 now or 19, to me, that's too many parties for a country that small in terms of population. There were only 3 parties, obviously, in parliament. We know that, right? The Bright Armenia, Prosperous Armenia, and the My Step coalition. And now, of course, as elections are looming large, there are coalitions forming. What's your sense that is needed to go forward? After all, you talked about failed states, whether it's India, whether it's the US, and every country in some form of another. But, it makes me remember Japan, right? I think you've talked about it over the last several months in some of your remarks. Japan was a failed state, lost, during Second World War, whatnot. What does a failed state do? And how are these folks, these coalitions, are going to kind of provide the public, me sitting here, for me to say, you know what? I want the best for my homeland, ancestral homeland, and the frontier of Artsakh. So I'm going to do everything I can to strengthen the Republic by assisting what I think, short of calling them saviors, the answer.
First and foremost, I've worked with politicians for most of my life, everywhere. And there's no such thing as political saviors. That does not exist. So if you're for, you hate Pashinyan, you love Pashinyan, you love this person, you hate this person, none of them are saviors. Because political problems are systematic in nature. They're not personally driven. And our problems are systematic. State building and sort of directional change of how you do things are far more based on what I call elite consensus, where the people, there's a democratic system that sort of reflects the popular will, but in almost every country, the main conversation is driven by what I call elite consensus. Now, sometimes the population reacts very harshly to elite consensus and essentially throws it out, which was, you can have it in a revolutionary situation. But for the most part, what matters is what the country's elite thinks that the country needs to do. And I think there's somewhat unanimity on moving forward in some of these fronts, with few exceptions here or there. But I think the elections are not going to solve all of our problems. That's just not, it's going to solve some of the problems. It's going to solve the legitimacy problems, and it's going to clear out who's what. But our approach needs to be on, essentially fundamentals of state building. You cooperate with whoever is building the state, whoever's building the apparatus of the military, whoever's rebuilding the apparatus of of a competent foreign policy team. Put things in perspective. The budget of our foreign relations of the MFA, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, is $30 million a year. You cannot run a competent worldwide foreign policy in a contested part of the world with $30 million a year. It doesn't work. You can't do that. What you'll end up getting is you'll end up getting 10 good diplomats and 50 that are involved in importing cars from Spain. That's what you're going to get. There's models for this. We need to go through the state apparatus and create your own, models of excellence. One of the things, for example, that works very well in Armenia is the central bank and the banking system. We actually have a very competent banking system. And part of the rule with the central bank is they actually, by law, have to pay competitive salaries. That's comparable to the private sector. One of the issues that we have is that no competent person in Armenia, with rare exceptions, or exceptionally patriotic or whatever, go into the state sector. Why would I go work for a $300 a month salary when I can work in the private sector and make 4 or 5 times that amount? Who would do that? Very few people. So you need to start professionalizing the state sector on different levels. The state in Armenia over the last 20 years has been used in the same way, as it was in Chicago back in the day. It was a source of employment. It was a source of patronage. So you had tons of people in these poor paying jobs, but they were paying, and it would keep the population employed, living on, very low salaries. And every family would put together 2 or 3 low salaries and you cover your expenses. But that does not show any level of competence, because those people really don't add anything. I mean, in some cases, frankly, you're better off paying people, telling them to stay home. So this kind of stuff is not sexy. There's no magic solutions. It doesn't involve traders, lack of traders. If you don't have that basic, competence level of that you put the resources where you need to. For example, I think in the foreign ministry and the defense ministry, you should have all the central bank rules. You try to get the best, the best and the brightest kids in Armenia don't go into the military as far as becoming officers and things. For the most part, the people who go into the military, and God bless them for it, many of them, it's a good place to earn an above average salary and hope that if there's a war, the Russians end it soon.
Eric, since you concluded on hope that if there's a war, the Russians end it, you recently spoke, and you've now talked about pragmatism, building the economy, root out corruption within the military. I would add to that, improve the judiciary and the justice system so that the average person knows that they can get their day in court if need be. But when we talk about the military, you recently made a remark and kind of drew a parallel between Aliyev of Azerbaijan and the late Saddam of Iraq. And you said, well, he's sort of kind of Saddam-esque, and he's really talking to his people when he's making these threats. He's kind of his primary audience is his people. But for the person sitting here, and even perhaps the person sitting in Syunik, the sight of these soldiers coming and going in that roads and that shenanigans that seem to be going on there, it's kind of unnerving, especially, we're just trying to process all these months later what exactly happened to our generation of soldiers in Artsakh. Do you think that I kind of want to hear more from you about you drew a parallel about the railroad, and you said, well, it's okay, and I don't want to misquote you. I think you said it's good if we have a direct line to Iran and Russia from Armenia. And I know that, Turkey and Azerbaijan want to have their connectivity going through Armenia territory, if you will, because of that 9-step whatever agreement. What could you say about that, and how safe is to go down that path in the interest of economy? Of course, I get it. I come from a very poor background, from a place called Burçhamut, where I lived number of years in Beirut before I came to the States. So I'm all for the economy, but I also, there's got to be a safety factor before you think about improving your lifestyle.
Well, I don't know where you want me to start. You want me to talk about, these roads? Listen, I think there's the philosophical, there's the broad, the universal, and then there's the specific. As far as the universal approach is concerned, the more access roads you have through your country, the better, to be honest with you. The more traffic through your country, the better, because people will have to think twice or three times before starting a war when they can lose that access. I think for the purpose of the Syunik Road, frankly, that is more, it's far more symbolic than it has any economic relevance. I think it has a political symbolism for Aliyev to say, I forced these guys to allow us to build a road. Now, this road, the way everyone understands it, is a road it's in sovereign Armenian territory through Syunik, and it's going to be supervised by the Russians in the same way that the Russians handle the road that connects Armenia now to Artsakh, now that we don't control those territories. So in some ways, this road can, guarantee our access to Artsakh, because if you lose one, then you lose the other. So it becomes this payoff. Secondly, as a practical matter, on all those years where we had all those liberated occupied territories, however you call it, Azeris were going and coming from Nakhchivan, essentially on a parallel road that ran to the other side of the Iranian border. There's actually a road that touches the Araks River, the south of the Araks River, and these people would come and go all the time anyway. In fact, there's a train that runs from Baku to Nakhchivan that gets you there in 18 hours. They spend tons of money fixing it, building it, and it takes nobody from somewhere to nowhere, because there's nothing going on in Nakhchivan. It's an economic basket case, and almost all the men there walk across the border to Iran and Turkey as day laborers. So there's this political symbolism of forcing, us to allow this road. As a practical matter, it doesn't really change much of anything as long as we hold the sovereignty of the road. As you know, any road in the world can be stopped by two drunk people with a shotgun. I mean, that's just the reality of it. So if this road, as long as it's not, the sovereignty of it isn't questioned, and it's run by the Russians, and if you go and come from Artsakh, the Russians are actually, fairly competent in keeping these things going and keeping it safe. We've had few issues of people going and coming from Artsakh. Hopefully it stays that way. So I think in that way. Now, if by allowing this road, you get the train networks opened up to Iran through Nakhchivan, which have been stopped since 1992 or earlier, and the train networks through Azerbaijan to Russia, because Russia is one of our biggest trading partners. We come out the better end of it, as long as the national security issues are held, which is that we control, it's our sovereign road, it's on our sovereign territory. If it's run by the Russians, it is run by the Russians. So I think that's, that's sort of the pragmatic view of it. Now, given all these things that are going on with POWs and things, I don't even know what the timeline for this would even be, because none of this would ever happen before all of that stuff is cleared out. So as far as, the threats that he makes, are concerning. I mean, they're all for local consumption. And then there's different reasons for it. You always have to put yourself in your opponent's shoes, no matter how imbecilic your opponent is. And I'll get back to that. What is concerning from our end at this point, that he's making these threats, which if he ever wants to carry them out, he's in a full-scale confrontation with the Russian military, which is not something he wants. Mm-hmm. And by the way, there's multiple Russian bases now in Sunik. So I think this is just stuff that he's talking about is fantasy more than anything. What is concerning is the reality of the moment is, given the situation of our military, we actually are not in a position to guard our borders entirely, because our military is not where it needs to be. Now, can that change 2, 4, 5 years from now? Yes. But if there was no Russian presence there, if the Russian fear guarantee wasn't there, yeah, you could have a questionable situation. But that's just not realistic. So a lot of this is for domestic consumption. And why does he have to say this for domestic consumption? Is because his perspective, the case that he's made is that we won, case over, there's nothing to discuss. Well, if we've won, case over, and nothing to discuss, why are there 4 armies on your territory that are not Azeri? Right now, Artsakh has become the world's biggest, nicest Russian military base. That's the reality of it. There's Armenian military there. There's Artsakh military there. There's Turkish military now in Azerbaijan, which really wasn't there until last year. Mm-hmm. So here's a guy who was all proud of the fact that, he's an independent country and there's no foreign troops on her. Now there's, 4 sets of foreign troops on territory that he claims. And at the end of the day, his people are going to wake up to find out, well, this issue hasn't been solved. And why are these Russians coming and going through our country night and day on these train tracks? By the way, I mean, as far as the weaponry in Artsakh right now, the Russians have violated every part of the agreement that they signed. They have more weapons than they have any. It's not 2,000 troops. It's a whole bunch of more troops listed as nurses and teachers and half a dozen different things. They have sophisticated anti-aircraft systems, anti-drone systems. They took all kinds of things in there, and none of this was hidden. I mean, you can see reporters that watch these things come and go, and they were transporting them through Azeri territory, through their train tracks, or over their territory by plane. So I think, it's what is concerning is that our military right now is not capable of defending the country, and that needs to change. Now, what he says has once we have the ability to secure ourselves, then what he says really doesn't matter. Because what matters is, what facts on the ground are. But right now, the reality is, who's guarding our border and who's guaranteeing the security of Armenia is actually Russia. It's not the Armenian military for the current time being.
And Eric, let me jump in here, because I think that, I want to maybe shift the conversation just a little bit on drawing some of these points out. Clearly, this is one of the major fears that international lawyers were talking about the minute the agreement was signed, is that one of the elements of a sovereign state is to protect your borders. I mean, that's one of the 4 main, kind of bullet points, if you will, in the Montevideo Convention. Clearly, we're not doing that. We know that we can't do that. And I'm piggybacking this on the Human Rights Ombudsman's comments in the National Assembly just a couple days ago. regarding the information and information regarding the post joint statement processes. And I think that clearly it's a difficult situation. There's no question about that. In the past, you've graded institutions, you've graded people on how they've worked. I want to ask you kind of point blank here. For those that don't know, the Human Rights Ombudsman's statement was that there's sugarcoating essentially going on by the government with respect to the post, in Sunni especially, in terms of the post-statement processes, right? That it's not all is good, all is well, which is what he stated was coming out from the government. And in fact, there are human rights issues, there are civil rights issues, there's, as we discussed just now, territorial issues and border issues, and there are a number of issues that, we can talk about them in a vacuum, but let's not forget, we were also upending families from Karvajar in 24 hours time with nobody participating essentially in assisting them. And then we're also having villagers deal with the Ghazarian military point blank, literally, in their villages, trying to figure out where their properties end and where the properties begin. I guess if we talk about, in a theoretical sense, the idea of tracks coming, rails and transportation links, I get all that. But in the context of what actually transpired here, aren't we missing the boat here? Isn't the real issue here the fact that for us as a society to regain a national identity of pride, which allows us to do a whole bunch of things, kind of that soft, the soft revival, the personal revival that causes people to want to stay in Armenia, to invest in Armenia, to build state institutions. There is and we haven't even gotten to the POW issue right now. How would you grade the government in dealing, and this is not a political, this is really just kind of from a legal standpoint, from a diplomatic standpoint, in handling the post-armistice, if you will, reality that they're faced with? I mean, I'm not saying it's easy. It's absolutely complex. Whether you call it a capitulation or not is really secondary. The bottom line is that there are terms, and now you have a whole bunch of other parties, as you identified, in the mix. But Mr. Tatoyan's comments kind of highlight a point. Is there full appreciation of the severity of the issue, of these issues? Is there full appreciation of the fact that all is not well, and maybe there is there's not necessarily a benefit to communicating that all is all well, if that's what's happening? What are your thoughts on that? Well,
I mean, listen, the grade is an F as far as how, but then this goes back to the failures of state institutions. How can it be not an F? For example, if you knew you had to give up, all the occupied territories, well, you come up with your own maps that say, okay, well, this is why, and then you get into the argument. And these are the GPS positions and all that. Now, frankly, part of the issue was that a lot of these liberated occupied territories, however you want to call them, had become totally integrated into the Sunni subculture, economy, and things. Mm-hmm. So there's a bit of angst about, I used to have my land there, and that land was across the international, what was considered an international border, and now it's there, and I'm pissed off about it. Well, yeah, I mean, you have that element. But this was a state that was entirely unprepared for those sets of conversations. Obviously, it's a state that was unprepared militarily, given the post-war defeat, to even, that's why the Russians are in Sunik. The Russian base was never in Sunik, it was in Gyumri. And the Russians' presence in Sunik, by the way, started during the war. It was not something that was post-war. It was actually during the war. So there's, the grade is a fail as far as the entire approach to things, because we didn't have a state that for 28 years figured that one day this day will come, and how do you deal with it? While the other side was prepared for it. Now, I think the one thing that people and I know you guys are in the diaspora, there's this constant, incessant propaganda about, Sunni's about to be invaded and this and that. And that is not true. And then if there's been a shooting across that border, I have not heard of it. In CivilNet, we have reporters there all the time, and we pick up people's angst, but what is perceived to be the realities, especially in the United States, compared to what is real, is not the same. So the government grade is a fair, but I think there's also a tendency to I mean, I get these, notes. I've heard that in 36 hours, Sunni is going to be invaded. It's like, well, how do you know that sitting in Burbank? So I think it's you have to grade harshly what's reality, which is the failures of on all levels, on the border demarcation issue, on who's where, and they get to do what, and not exaggerate what's going on there, because some of the stuff is exaggerated.
Karnig, if I may, you talked about there's reporters there, and you would know if there was a shooting, but there was a shooting from outskirts of Stepanakert by Azeris onto a home of an Armenian villagers, I believe, roof. And yes, there's all these Russian troops, and yeah, I tend to agree with you that it would be rather foolhardy for Aliyev to think that he can start another offensive, much like the one he did on September 27. But the instigations seem to be ongoing, including throwing rocks at at passerby cars, and those folks want to have some sense of security and safety, those who live in that area. And if the objective is, to depopulate Artsakh from Armenians and start taking domes of the Ghazanche, so it's church out in the name of, remodeling or whatever it is they're calling it. I go back to this, Eric. One thing that I've always understood, and I haven't understood many other things, but one thing I've understood, and I'm a firm believer in, every time Russia and Turkey seem to be, hunky-dory with each other, somehow Armenia and Armenians get screwed. I'm just waiting to see, and I'm hoping that the other shoe does not drop. And I'm a bit encouraged today, and I want your views on, with Erdogan today talking about, he's still, Turkey's still striving to join the EU, and that they're looking forward to it. And, but I'm mindful of the fact that they've been doing this, for 15, 16 years they've been negotiating, and they first tried to join the EU 30 years ago. So what are your thoughts? Do you think that Erdogan is finally thinking that Russia, Turkey, cooperation, collaboration, I'll give you a piece of Syria you can control, let me control this part of the world, and you can deal with Artsakh, all of that is going to run into a problem. And is that problem going to inure to the Armenians' benefit?
First of all, when I said there was no shooting, I meant Sunni. I did not.
Yeah, I know you did, but that's why I took you to the other place. Yeah, I know.
I think yes, I think that the Azeri approach to Artsakh, what is Artsakh now, is to essentially what I call the Gaza-ification of the place. If they could, they could turn it into this miserable enclave where people want to leave, or it becomes unlivable. That's the only good thing with that is that's in direct contradiction to what the Russians want, because if there's no Armenians in Artsakh, there's no Russian presence. So we have actually mutuality of interest with them. And what I mean by cold-hearted pragmatism earlier is to come up with the systems that guarantee levels of security, no matter how unpalatable it is, driving through their territory. And at some point, you're always going to have once in a while issues that's a given. You just don't want it to become systematic, because we have shootings on our border too, in Tavush and places, and more often than not, if you talk to local people, it involves a couple of people getting really drunk on the other side and shooting up in the air. So, there's a difference between that and some systematic approach. So our job is to come up with systems that allow people in the current condition with the Russian peacekeepers and border guards to have people in Artsakh live in as much security as possible. So that's one thing. As far as Erdogan is concerned, almost everything that's happening with Erdogan is really related to the Turkish economy. Mm-hmm. And in fact, you can even claim that last year's war was just another part of a scheme to distract people from what's going on. The country is in severe economic problems, and it's going to crescendo to some. They have massive debt problems, which is very typical of economies like that, and they usually almost inevitably end either with an economic collapse or them being forced to go to some international institutions for a huge bailout. The problem for that is if he goes to the international institutions for a big bailout, part of the price he has to pay for that is political independence. Mm-hmm. So I think he's you have to understand Erdogan is, people are almost all in politics, they're always their first job. Whatever their first job was, that's what they are. And what he is, he's a mayor. His whole thing is even this canal that they're building, this has a lot more to do with, helping his developer friends and construction companies, which are part of his base. So people don't understand the scale of the Turkish economic problems. A little past our border into, Western Armenia, there was a municipality in Turkey. This became a big issue in Turkey, in which, 5,000 people applied for 11 janitorial positions in a city hall, of which 3,000 of them were college graduates. If you look at surveys in polling in Turkey, 75% of young people between 18 and 30 want to leave the country. 75%. That number in Armenia is 20%, to put things in perspective. So this is a country that is heading towards, they have some of the highest inflation rates in the world outside of the Argentinas and the Zimbabwe's. Their currency, in 2014, their per capita income was 3.5 times Armenia's. Now it's twice Armenia's. Their per capita income is in the $8,000 to $9,000 range. To put things in perspective, Argentina is $13,000, and that's a basket case. Greece, not exactly Switzerland, is at 20,000. So this is a country that's it's heading towards deep turmoil. And once that day comes, and it's a matter of time and how it comes, it's going to it has less ability to impact things around it. And what's clearly emboldened Aliyev is the boldness of this Turkish neo-Ottomanism. The problem that Erdogan has at the end of the day, when all is said and done, is you cannot have Xi Jinping type ambitions with an Argentine type economy. It just doesn't add up. And at some point, if he has to come to the IMFs and the World Banks for a bailout, what's going to come with that is the second circumcision of his life politically. That's what's going to come with it. That's just the way these guys work. You get our money, then we get to tell you what to do. And what that means is that, you pull out of Libya, you stop threatening the Greeks, you become what you are, which is a mid-level power with a good military and a functional state, but a dysfunctional society and a dysfunctional economy.
Since you talked about polling and the graphic description of what may come of Erdogan, I want to know, what are your thoughts on polling in Armenia? I had seen some recent polls. I don't know if that's the most recent one I saw, where it kind of was placing different personalities, army, human rights defender being, at some rating, and the current prime minister being at another rating. But today, or rather yesterday in Armenia, it would be now, on Sunday, I believe there was a rally where the second president in a coalition walked, from what I saw, some footage, walked the streets, went to Liberty Square. Has the campaign season begun in Armenia already? And what the polls are suggesting?
Well, first of all, in Armenia, unlike the United States or most of the world, well, actually, unlike the United States, but like most of the world, campaign season is very limited. Technically, the campaigns are actually 2 weeks before the election, where you can actually do a lot of things. And even then, the day before the election, everything stops because that's the day where everyone's supposed to think, have quiet to think, which is one of the funniest things that I recall having coming from the United States. But no, the campaigns have started. And the polling has been very consistent. This is through multiple polls. Depending on the poll, the prime minister's coalition, comes in somewhere between, low end of 30, 35, high end of 50, depending on whose poll it is. Then there's the former street opposition, as I call it, the 17 parties. They come in roughly somewhere around 20%. And then everyone in the other 30, 35% are people who are former, essentially, Pashinyan supporters who are mostly disappointed, or former revolution supporters that are disappointed by the government or by Pashinyan, or the lack of competence in the state level. And if you look at one of the most greatest ironies ever, if you look at Pashinyan's base of supporters, it is exactly Erdogan's base of supporters. Pashinyan's base, if you look at the crosstabs in a polling, are rural, older, and low income. While the people who have no political home right now are going to become either support a third force or stay home, are urban, upper income, and young. Essentially, the foot soldiers of the revolution have left Pashinyan. There's people who actually, fought in the streets, and, the tech workers that walked out. That professional thinking class has essentially left them. So he's left with this lower income, rural base. And I think it's important to understand how this works and why. And if you go to rural Armenia now, you'll see it. Rural Armenia, unlike urban Armenia during the former regime, was not even an oligarchic one. It was actually a feudal system. In which, everything, these feudal, oligarchic lords had far more power over you than if you lived in Yerevan. You wanted to open up a car wash, you had to go see this person. There was just absolutely no freedom to do things. While if you go to the rural areas of Armenia now, there's like a bevy of activity. Everyone who can is opening up a food court. Everyone who can is, the shackles have been removed from people. So there's a lot more economic freedom to do what they want without having these local thuggish chiefdoms telling them what to do. And there's also been, one of the things that you'll notice is, to the extent that, all those fallow lands that you would see, a lot of them are coming into production because of, there's this actually very good government program. I don't even know who really started it, but you essentially can get a loan up to $22,000 with no interest with 5 years, that without prepayments for 5 years. So what you see everywhere is hothouses going up, and everybody who can is growing tomatoes in hothouses or other things. So there's a lot of this rural base of the prime minister is actually quite real, and it's quite solid, and it'll never leave him. And it's not just rural; it's also small town in places like Gyumri and places like that. So, and a good chunk of that is really driven by the hatred of the old regime. It's not even a question of loving the prime minister. He's just seen as the person that defeated them. So his base, it's hard to see any election process in which he and his coalition don't come in first. It's a question of who else gets in there with him. Does the third force emerge and become the second biggest party, or does the Kocharian, ARF, however you want to call it, the coalitions, the old regime types, become the primary opposition? But the polling has been quite consistent. But if, where I'm sitting is where the prime minister is weakest at. And the further you get away from here, the stronger he becomes.
Interesting. Karnig?
Yeah, I guess, that is, one of the things that we saw in the earlier poll that we had discussed a number of episodes ago was the issue. I mean, we were surprised where Artsakh fell, where national security interests fell on
priorities,
on the priorities of. Do you see that, Eric, holding? Do you see that changing as we get closer and closer? Do you think that the POW situation impacts the priorities that people are assigning or would perhaps assign over the next several weeks? How do you see that priority list playing out from that? And I think you remember the poll that we're referring to. How do you think that holds out up in this campaigning season?
It's hard to say. It really depends on how effectively the opposition uses it. If that's what they're talking about night and day, you're going to move some numbers there. But I think there's a more important philosophical point here. That poll results shocked a lot of people because you notice that Artsakh or even national security. I mean, Artsakh itself was like the third or fourth issue in the country, and I think this is the big difference between living here and living in the diaspora. And I'm going to say this very carefully. For a lot of people in the diaspora, national security and Artsakh are the only issues. While if you live here, even if you care a lot about Artsakh and national security for many is actually more important than Artsakh, is not the only issue. Economy is a serious issue. Recovering from the COVID recession is an important issue. State building is an issue. So there's this prism view from the diaspora that is totally focused on Artsakh because that's what we've been talking about for 30, 35 years. But Armenia is a holistic country. It's got, you can talk to people on the street who tell you they could care less about Artsakh. Very few, but you'll run into them. It's like, why are we doing this? This should nothing but a headache. You'll get, very few people, but you'll get that. And the further away, before the war, you would hear it more. There's an element of, we've paid this price for these Artsakh who've sent us two presidents that robbed us blind. There is that element, but that's a distinct minority. For the most part, Artsakh is seen as one issue among many others. In the diaspora, it is the only issue. So I think people need to understand, and I think there's an element in the diaspora that needs to understand that this country is more than just one issue, and it's got the same issues that everybody else has. People are worried about the kids' education. The education system here is quite poor. It's not producing, the children. Your kids can go through it for 12 years, and unless you have the resources to give them extra, you give them an extra push, they're not going to be ready to get into the job market. So that polling numbers are not going to change. This does not mean for 1 minute that people don't care about Artsakh. That's not a priority for them. It's just simply a priority among many others. While in the diaspora, it's the only priority. And I'll say this, and this is a gripe that I have, is that for many years people came and went from here. Everybody went to their, what I call theme park vacations. You took the picture by the tank at Shushi on the entrance, and you felt really good. But when you left, nothing had changed. And I would talk to diasporans about how fantastic everything was. This is in 2013, 2014, where people had given up hope on the political system ever changing, and anybody who was trying to find a way to leave. And there's diasporans saying how wonderful everything is, and people didn't appreciate the fact that not building a competent economy in a competent state, a theme park isn't going to stand.
You're reminding me, Eric, of my often battle cry to fellow diasporans that homeland is not a place you go to vacation. Homeland is home, and you go home, you strengthen your home, and you provide the necessary resources for home to be home. And I've been going to Armenia, as I said to you before we got on the air, for about 15 years. I'm a late bloomer. But with the exception of the first time I was there, perhaps at most, my trips to Armenia and Artsakh have always had a focus of somehow doing something, some small thing in some small measure to be able to make a difference. Small, just small the difference. Karnig, I'm going to defer to you, but I do want, before we go towards the end of our discussion, I want, if you don't mind, Eric, tell us, are the Russians, in your opinion, going to stay there for 5 years, 10 years, or less or longer? What does it look like?
500.
Okay, because that's what I'm thinking. I'm thinking, doesn't look like these folks would be going anytime soon, because I've heard the same things you just spoke about, the hardware that has been transported.
Listen, from a very cynical perspective, they're the second biggest winners after Aliyev in this war.
Mm-hmm.
Because they've always wanted to have their troops' presence back there. Now they're back there. And by being there, they have their foot at the throat of Armenia, because Armenia's foreign policy options get vastly limited. Mm-hmm. You have to worry about the safety of Artsakhis, which are guaranteed by the Russians at this point, not by us. Mm-hmm. People need to understand that. We are not guaranteeing their safety. Hopefully 5-10 years from now that can change. But right now we're not. And they also have their foot at the throat of Azerbaijan, because they have thousands of troops and a huge military presence in a place that Azeris consider their own territory. Just quite a humiliating concession from their perspective. And it'll become more of an issue as time goes by and as Aliyev becomes less popular. So will they leave? Will anyone dare to ask them to leave? Not likely. But let's not forget, one fact. In the last century, twice, the Russian and the Soviet state collapsed. Mm-hmm. Because they have an unstable political system and have a history of having unstable political systems. Do I think anyone's going to ask them to leave? No. And if they're asked to leave, will they actually leave? I highly doubt that, because this is a strategically important part of the world for them, and their presence is important, and their presence is predicated on having Armenians in Artsakh. That's the key thing that we need to drive home. Is that that's the one place where our interests are mutual. And that's what we need to focus on right now, is for people to be able to live in stability and peace, even if that stability and peace is, something that is time dated and will come to an end at, 10 years from now, 2 decades from now, or listen, there's other examples of this. If you look at the Russians in Abkhazia, if you look at the Russians in Ossetia, or in other parts of similar situations, some of these situations go on for a quarter century, nothing changes. And they have a vested interest in these issues not clarifying. So this gray area situation is actually helpful to that. Because gray area situations allow them to become the primary players. But as far as when they'll leave, I would highly doubt that they leave. Because
I think if I can interject, Eric, here, I think I want to get your thoughts on this. And, Armenia's near foreign policy at this point, right, was going to have to take some change, is going to have to undergo some changes with respect to what role Armenia is going to play in Artsakh, because as you said, we are no longer the protector, which was the principal role that Armenia played. And what do you see, and I want to get to the POW question before we have to, just real quickly though, what do you see in terms of, whether it's the political elites or the intelligentsia in Armenia, how are they going to start thinking about what the role of Armenia is in this period of this new period of Artsakh's reality?
I will say, I don't think people have entirely come over the trauma of having complete control and complete security for people there. And I don't think people have reconciled themselves to that. But once they reconcile themselves to that, it's going to be, how do you cooperate with the Russians to guarantee their security? How do you draw in the international community to guarantee their security, while all at the same time rebuilding your army, rebuilding your capabilities, and waiting for another political moment? And remember, the Azeris used a political moment, or I should say actually Erdogan used a political moment that was quite unique. That war could not have happened 6 months before. It couldn't have happened now, because the political situation, the war would have been ended by different parties earlier and would have had different results. So, but those political situations go both ways historically. We need to understand, to the extent that no matter what Aliyev says or what the Azeris say, they have fundamental issues, which are one of the reasons they needed to act. This war needed to happen for them now, because this war would have been far harder to do 5 or 10 years from now. Over the next 10, 15 years, and depending on technological progress that has nothing to do with anybody in this part of the world, the decarbonization of the world economy can catch speed much faster. I was talking to people in the energy industry, in which now, natural gas was supposed to be the replacement for oil, but now the best renewables, the best performing renewables now match natural gas prices, which means in 5 years from now, they can overwhelm all these countries fighting over the Mediterranean on this pipeline or that pipeline. The scale of technological advancement on the renewables can blow all of them out of the water, or make a lot of the expensive projects not viable. The second thing you have to understand about their oil industry is, one, their oil production has been going down. In fact, it was supposed to peak at 2015, it peaked 2011. So every year the oil production goes down. While at the same time, their actually price point for oil production is actually much higher than other places. They produce, their production costs are in the mid to high 20s, depending on who you believe. In a place like Saudi Arabia, it's $2-3. So if you look at who's going to go out of the oil business first it's going to be the Americans and the Canadians with all the fracking and all that, because it's just not viable. Then it's going to be the secondary level producers, which are the people who are spending $20 to $40 to pump a barrel of oil. And the last oil in the world will be pumped in Saudi Arabia, because you put your finger in the ground and something comes out. So and in the history of the world, there's not a case of any country being able to transition from that kind of dependence on one source to other things smoothly. In order to do that, you need, Japanese or German style planning and no corruption. Well, the central essence of their state is corruption. So, we always tend to underestimate we don't put ourselves in the enemy's shoes. And people forget this. In 2019, in per capita income, Georgia passed Azerbaijan. And before COVID in 2020, Armenia was stated to pass Azerbaijan in per capita income. Now, put that in perspective. This is a country that since 1994 has earned $250 billion in oil monies, compared to two countries that have literally hardly negligible natural resources. And those two countries without any resources, one of them landlocked with closed borders, has a higher per capita income than your country does, after $250 billion in money. So they see what's coming. Even in population, their population has peaked. You had this great migration from rural areas to the urban areas after the war, after independence, and their population projections have peaked. as far as replace. They're like right now replacement level, when in most developing countries, it's always far more than that. So time was not on their side if they had waited. And they managed to find the exact right time, or Erdogan did, and they acted on it, and it paid off. But these things have a way of changing. They change over time, and things change on a dime. And he's going to have to. He's in his 60s. He has to hand over power at some point to his son, or to his wife, or to his daughters. And to put things in perspective, when you're looking at non-royal states, essentially you're a legal kingdom, not an actual one like Azerbaijan, a practical one. The Aliyevs have been in power in Azerbaijan one way or the other since 1969, except for a short period of time during perestroika. What that means is that that family has run Azerbaijan longer than the Assads have ruled Syria. In fact, the only people that have ruled the only family that has ruled any country longer than the Aliyevs have ruled Azerbaijan is the Kims in North Korea. And when the end comes, the end is going to be dramatic, because no country outside of the Kims has been able to do that third generational handoff. Because generally in these families, every generation becomes more corrupt and imbecilic than the previous one, or less credible. And you combine that with an economy that's not going to have as much money as before if this decarbonization takes off. The political instability of Azerbaijan is the biggest national security threat facing Armenia. And that's something that we have very little control over. That's the biggest threat to Armenia is the post-Aliyev Azerbaijan, because you could have a Syria in your hand. You could have a Libya in your hand. Those scenarios don't end well. One of the most ironic things is that this victory in this war guarantees that the Aliyevs will rule Azerbaijan for the last decade or two where carbon energy matters. When what they needed is a revolution and a reform government that can actually use the money for the people's benefits, that can actually make that transition or try to make that transition.
Eric, if I may, in the couple of minutes that we have left, shift over to the POW issue. This past week has been a time period where many revelations have surfaced regarding the treatment of Armenian POWs, hostages in the hands of the Baku regime. You've been very astute in identifying the fact that no such accusations have ever been leveled against Armenia and its treatment of Azeri POWs. And these revolutions obviously are extremely disturbing. I mean, they're disturbing in the absolute sense when it comes to the Geneva Conventions and the international treatment of POWs, which is something every nation state needs to be concerned about and should be, at least in not only just in principle but in reality. What is the effect that is going to have, if it is going to have, like these revelations with respect to the treatment of Armenian prisoners of war in Azeri hands, on the ongoing negotiations? And if I can pull you back a little bit to describe how we actually got to this point, because I think in terms of the negotiation, what are your thoughts about how we ended up in this POW release imbalance, if you will, and how do these revelations, which will be increasing over time, there's no question about that, play into the actual resolution of the issue? I mean, this is something, many people complained about, looking at the statement saying, the trilateral statement saying that, it's absolutely clear under international law that this is an immediate release, right? The release, whether the language is there or not, the law is such that it's absolutely clear that release is immediate. whereas all the other things have these timing periods, and all those matters have been satisfied in terms of performance under the agreement. Where did we go wrong, and how do these revelations impact future negotiations? Do we see these things levying more pressure on the regime?
Well, it's a couple of things. First of all, these revelations make any negotiations on these other matters, stalled, because no government here can do anything on opening up, building any roads or anything like that while this is going on. It's just not going to happen. The political pressure is too intense. The international pressure is starting to grow on them. I don't know to what extent they care, because these are undefendable positions, to be honest with you. And at some point, they just need to understand that the political cost is too high and they let everyone go. I think what people, there's two kinds of people, from what I understand, and it's very complicated. The POWs right now are two kinds. They're essentially civilians that were taken hostage or kidnapped during the war. Now, some of these people, nobody really had a count on our side of who's what and who's missing. You had some, but you had very few documented. You didn't necessarily know someone was a prisoner of war there. A civilian was captured somehow or another. You really didn't know. So it was hard to get a quantified count. So they could lie all the time about who they have and who they don't have. And God knows what the hell was going on in these territories that they captured. It doesn't even mean that there was central command that was in any way instructing these people. It could be, some local, jihadist thugs that had captured a couple of people. So there's an element of control that we don't know. But right now, there's a total control on the other side. So they actually are in full control of the situation. So there's the civilians that were captured during the war, which they didn't account for, and they're purposely keeping them for the purposes of state terrorism, essentially, to intimidate, because they can. Remember, this is a state that sent its agents across the border into Georgia to kidnap a dissident journalist and brought him back, and then charged him and put him in jail for 7 years for being caught with euros that they had put on him. This is a state that kidnapped essentially an Israeli blogger, Lapshin.
Yes.
Put him on a presidential plane and brought. So this is the nature of this thuggish neo-fascist outfit in Baku. Okay, this is nothing out of the ordinary. The second, that now most of the military POWs are literally most of the people that are in captivity right now, as far as the military POWs, are people who were captured in these Hadrut operations. There were 3 villages in Hadrut, and the agreement was essentially where you stopped is where it was yours. Mm-hmm. So these guys were in Hadrut defending those 3 villages, and at some point, someone either on the Turkish or Azeri side decided, well, we don't want this outfit here. We don't want these 3 outlying villages in Hadrut. So almost a good chunk of the people captured were actually captured in those operations. So this was actually post the exchange of prisoners that happened right after the war. So a lot of these people were actually captured after the exchange. So that's the outline of who's there. I'm sorry, I lost. What was the original question outside of who's what?
I guess the question is how did we end up in this imbalance in terms of negotiations?
Well, Then the imbalance was that most of these people, many of these people were either unaccounted for if they were civilians, or they were captured after the exchange. So they became this political football for them to use. And what we need to do as a collective is to make that political football way too costly for them. For example, I can just give you a perfect example. You don't even have to go there. If someone proposes a law threatening them with these Magnitsky sanctions on Aliyev unless he releases these prisoners, if our advocacy organizations can get 1 or 2 congressmen or senators to propose that, that's going to scare the hell out of them, because those prisoners are not worth that for them to be even in that conversation. Mm-hmm. So it's going to, at some point, these people are going to get released. They're just trying to use it as a factor of state terror, to terrorize our side, that this is what we can do to you, or to terrorize people in Artsakh, and to use it to get concessions. But there are no more concessions to be had anyway. So We just need to bang away at them until they give in. But I'm not, given the nature of the regime, can this go on for months? Oh, absolutely. Can it go on for a year? I can see that. I can see them, releasing 4 people a month. The other day they released 3 people out of 170.
Yeah.
If you release 3, why don't you? I mean, nothing tells you more about the regime we're dealing with than this. And on some level, the reason I think that this isn't as much of a political issue here as it is, it's an emotional issue. It's a human rights issue, is because people understand the nature of the other side, and they would be doing this if I was running the country, if Ghazarian was running the country, or 17 other people, because this is who they are.
Yeah. Well, Eric, thank you so much for joining us today. This has really been, we covered a lot of topics, and it's been extremely enlightening, and the opportunity to dig in to a lot of your insights is really priceless. So we do very much appreciate that. And hopefully you'll join us again at some point in the future as we get nearer the elections, and perhaps even post-election, to give your impressions of how things went. And I'd like to kick it over to Garo to make his final comments before we close up for a program that really has been really deep and enlightening. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Karnig. I also want to thank you, Eric, for taking the time out and spending it with us and our audience. I will say that one of our former guests was U.S. Congressman Adam Schiff, and we did cover the Magnitsky Act. He actually brought it up when we asked what can be done. And we continue our efforts off the air in certain circles, as I'm sure you and others do in their individual capacities. What I want to share in closing is this. Eric Hacopian, unbeknownst to Eric Hacopian, kicked off what we anticipate will be our next 5 or 6 weeks leading up to the parliamentary elections in Armenia. We wanted to start it off this evening or this morning in Armenia with Eric to have an objective dialogue about what are some of the things that were on our minds and what were some of the thoughts and viewpoints that Eric could share with us. In the days and weeks ahead, we are going to increasingly have different persons and personalities that will have very differing views. Perhaps we will agree with some of their viewpoints, perhaps we won't, but that brings me to my closing remarks. Earlier today, on Sunday, here on Mother's Day, I was having a phone conversation with a dear friend of mine. And he said to me, he said, Garo, you and Karnig have to decide, ask yourselves, how do you see yourselves? Do you see yourselves as the role of journalists, with this Frontlines, things that you folks started on September 27? Or do you see yourselves as opinion makers? I didn't have to think much. I said, well, no, I don't think we're journalists. And I don't know about opinion makers, but I could tell you this. We're both lawyers. We're both very passionate about human rights and civil rights. And what we hoped to do from day one, and what we hope to do in the days and weeks ahead, is to shed light through our guests on issues of critical importance on the ground. And issues of critical importance not just to Armenia and Artsakh, but also diaspora. And again, in reverse order, not just the diaspora, as Eric pointed out, the different priorities that exist, but also those of importance to Artsakh and those of importance to Armenia. We've spoken to a lot of people over the last several months. I lost count, but one day I'm going to sit down and count them. I know it's in the multiple dozens. But I could tell you the 2 of our upcoming guests. We are looking forward to having Wednesday morning, Yerevan time, Tevan Bogosyan, who I believe is the advisor of the president of Armenia. And in the days after that, we anticipate, Eric, you will appreciate this perhaps, I certainly do, Vahan Zanoyan, who's a global energy expert, who we look forward to speaking about some of the very issues that you just touched upon, in terms of these oil-producing countries and things of that sort. And we're going to go on, and we're going to have invitations that are outgoing already, and bring about guests that will represent these various political alliances, and we want to hear from each and every one of them. Why is it that, in their opinion, they are the answer, if they are the answer? With that, we will look for Eric to join us one day soon, in the interim or thereafter, as time permits, so you can give your political assessment of that, because that is not something that, at least I cannot say that I have any political background in that respect. I want to thank you, Eric. We follow you, as many others do here and elsewhere. You do good work. You do great work, and the reason I know you do, because not everybody likes you, and that's a great thing when everybody doesn't like you. I can speak from experience. Have a pleasant day in Yerevan, and I hope to see you in Yerevan one of these days soon. Karnig?
Thank you for your kind words. It was a pleasure joining you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Eric.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye-bye.